Hi everyone, hope you're doing well today. Just wanted to go over some of our quiz questions from last week. I am actually going to change things up this week a little bit, and I'm going to do this shorter Ed puzzle. And then I'm also going to do, and I'll also go over the week to come in this Ed puzzle. But I'm going to do a longer Ed puzzle, or not even an Ed puzzle. I'll probably just I will just post it as a YouTube video in the classroom that's more lecture. Hopefully that will help. It's more lecture based on the quizzes or the textbook, so therefore to help with the quizzes and whatnot. So I'm not going to make it mandatory because we already have this video, but I'd certainly encourage you to take a look at it, and it'll certainly. For anyone that's having some trouble with the quiz structure, like I had mentioned previously, these quizzes are rooted more in knowledge and understanding of the topics as opposed to just rote memorization or recall. So hopefully it'll help with that. Hearing a little discussion about the topics that you're reading about in the textbook. So actually, I'm going to pop back out here and open up. Sorry, I'm ill prepared. Open up the classroom, and we can take a look at what we have to come this week. Sorry. So here we go. So this past week we had talked about ethics in a bunch of different areas in week 4. So ethics in marketing, ethics in managed care, resource allocation, social responsibility, those types of things. So this week we're actually going to really shift gears. But hopefully you saw some of the issues related to some of those areas. And like I had said, with regard to our discussion, there really have been a lot of these types of issues, resource allocation, ethics in social responsibility. Fiscal responsibility is another aspect that we're really seeing a lot of impacts, ethical issues, impacts related to COVID. So, for example, the layoffs and furloughs that are ongoing at organizations, is think of the ethics behind that. I mean, obviously, it's a financial decision because there aren't patients, there isn't money to pay them. But think about moving forward. Here are folks that are going to have to seek other roles elsewhere. The ethics behind maintaining your healthcare workforce for when, as we're starting to see here in Western PA, the COVID numbers are climbing rapidly. And so making sure that you have the healthcare workforce on hand to do that they haven't gone off and gotten a different job and aren't available to come back to you versus keeping people on, maybe taking salary cuts across the board, those types of things. So there's some ethical decision making, even in that financial decision making as well. And then all of that, especially with COVID, relates to resource allocation, access to care, social responsibility, et cetera. So a lot there to kind of measure and digest as well. I will go over, probably within the next couple of days, go through your final project topics, and I'll provide feedback on them. So as long as you submitted it and it makes sense, you'll likely receive full credit on that. But I do want to provide feedback. Sometimes folks are much too broad. Sometimes folks are much too narrow. Sometimes you've chosen a topic that really doesn't have two sides to it, where pretty much anybody that's breathing would believe that that's the right thing to do. So I'm really looking for you to dig in and choose something that you can kind of explore both sides, and that is an ethical dilemma as opposed to just a topic in health administration. Obviously, you've got plenty of other classes or have had plenty of other classes to explore some of those areas, but we're looking specifically at ethical dilemmas faced in the healthcare admin world. So in week 5, we're moving into what I would probably consider kind of the most commonly thought of ethical issues for healthcare administrators, but certainly not by any means the majority of issues that you'll face from being an administrator. The types of things that you will face are much more than these things. But I think from a layperson's standpoint, this is what people think of. So things like physician-assisted suicide, death and dying, autonomy of patients, informed consent, all of those types of things, medical futility. Those are the types of things that that we're going to talk about this week, look at this week in our DAR textbook. We've got a discussion, which is a case study. We've also got an individual case study for you to complete for your written assignment this week. And then obviously, I see I've got a typo there. I apologize for that. That will go away here momentarily when I post this Edpuzzle, and then our quiz. I will also post the additional, it's not done yet. I'm going to do that right after I complete this, but I will post the additional lecture video as well, and hopefully it'll help to give you some more concrete thoughts on some of the issues that we're discussing this week. So let's jump in here to the quiz questions. So first one, futility is suggested when, and so this futility is really when you've reached a point where it's medical treatment without hope of any benefit. So this is discussed, the theory of futility is discussed in chapter 13. Now it's discussed additionally in the chapters that we're talking about this week or looking at this week in the bioethics chapters, but it's also discussed in chapter 13, which was included in your last week's work. But it's really about that treatment that's beyond hope of a benefit. So if you have a patient that's terminally ill, and maybe they have cancer, they have some stage 4 cancer or whatever, and they've had chemo and they've had radiation and they've had surgery, and then maybe there's some new treatment that comes out that really is meant for people with a lesser stage of cancer, or maybe is just something that's not likely to work for this patient. There comes a point where additional treatment is futile. So doing treatment beyond that point where there's a hope for benefit is considered futility, and it's rooted in the term futile, meaning that it's not going to do anything for you. It's a futile effort. It's not going to help. And ultimately, when we're talking about medical treatments, it could actually hurt. It could cause discomfort. It could cause worsening of symptoms, etc. So some of the other questions that or some of the other answers people had chosen, the treatment is considered extraordinary care. That's not, sometimes futile treatments could be considered extraordinary care, but that's not for all futility. There are patients that are being provided extraordinary care that they've not reached a point of futility. So I think that's the kind of the nuance there. If you have like, for example, if the physicians that I go to or have gone to in the past in New York City, typically when you have you typically have a progression of care that you'll receive. So let's say you're going in for a rheumatological or an orthopedic issue. Typically they'll do a physical exam, then they'll do x-rays, sometimes CT if that makes sense for the area, and then they would go the final kind of premium treatment would be an MRI or a PET CT or whatever it happens to be based on the area that they're looking at. In the practice that I would go to, they would just immediately order those extraordinary things that perhaps weren't needed. And that's where they would jump right to that MRI or that PET CT when perhaps they could have found out what was wrong simply by physical exam, or maybe through the use of a much less expensive X-ray. So extraordinary care is that really going above and beyond what is the normal standard of care for that particular patient. But it's not always like if I'm having issues with my knee, it's not futility. It's just that's extraordinary care. Now there are times when you have terminal patients where they are receiving extraordinary care that is futile as well, but they are two different things. The other question or the other answer people chose was quality of life is no longer possible, and sadly that's not really part of futility. We may drive the discussion or the determination that a patient is beyond hope of a benefit if their quality of life is so bad and they've reached a point where nothing is going to work for them in the future. But there are plenty of patients, I can just speak to the experience I had with my dad when he had liver cancer, and he's since passed away. He's been gone 5 years. But I can say that, there was a point where his quality of life was horrid. But it didn't mean that he didn't still receive some sort of treatment, even if it was just, just things to keep him comfortable, comfort care type things. So quality of life sadly doesn't really play into it. And I'd be willing to bet if you talk to somebody, or if any of you yourselves have gone through hardcore chemo, radiation treatments, bone marrow transplantation, lots of different types of services that make quality of care or quality of life. I think I may have said quality of care a couple of times. I apologize. I meant quality of life, that make quality of life very poor. And that doesn't mean the treatment's futile. It just means life stinks right now. And hopefully, if the treatment's not futile, your quality of life will improve. If you have a situation where it's futile and the quality of life is no longer possible, then unfortunately it may not improve. But we'll talk more this week about things like physician-assisted suicide, where that is not legal in the state of Pennsylvania, but is legal in other states, where if you have that futility, terminal illness, and a poor quality of life, that is an option for some people. Not here where RMU is located and where I currently live, but that is an option for some people. So that's futility. Next one, when patients' decisions or demands will not result in an efficacious medical treatment or will only prolong suffering in the dying process. And then we have several things. So I'll talk a little bit about the question itself. So be sure that you're reading the entire question and looking at it closely. So in this case, we're kind of talking about two different types of patients. You have patients who are demanding treatment that's not likely to be effective for them. So a patient demands treatment that is not effective, or if a patient asks for or demands treatment that would only prolong the suffering and dying process. So there's two pieces to this. So our correct answer is clinicians have a moral obligation to withhold or withdraw treatment, which is from Chapter 13. And that's just, it's simply, we have, do no harm. We have a duty, providers have a duty to only provide patients the appropriate treatment, and not treatment that would not be effective for them or that would prolong suffering or dying. So it's important to see that from both standpoints. For example, if I go into my physician's office and demand, and this is where some of this problem has come from in this country, but and probably other countries as well. But if I go into my physician's office and demand, I have back pain, as most almost 50-year-old people do. But if I went in there and demanded a TENS unit, or if I demanded OxyContin, or if I demanded, perhaps something that wouldn't be effective at all, maybe like a brace or something, it's not only the right thing to do from a clinical standpoint, but it's also the right thing to do from a moral standpoint would be to withhold that treatment. If I have no reason to have something like OxyContin or a TENS unit, it would be inappropriate for them to give me that just because I have a little bit of back pain because I'm older and I weigh more than I should. So it's important for physicians to do that. The one that's easier to understand is if you have a patient that's demanding, take for example the discussion that I had mentioned in the last question. A patient, end-stage cancer, has gone through multiple rounds of chemo, radiation, with no impact, and they want to go through another round of chemotherapy. There's a moral issue here in that, is that going to work? If there's a potential that it'll work, then it's the appropriate thing to do. If it's a futile effort at that point, and will just prolong their suffering, then they do have a moral obligation to withhold that. The question or the answer that most other people chose that didn't get it right was clinicians have a moral obligation to compose futility guidelines. That's not, there may be guidelines decided, and probably are within most organizations, as to how they deal with patients that reach a point of medical futility. But that isn't rooted in this question. This question, like I said, it kind of has two pieces. It's patients demanding things that aren't effective for them for their condition, or patients demanding things or families demanding things that would prolong the suffering and dying process. So make sure that you kind of parse that out when you're looking at questions. Next one, no margin, no mission means, and I think I've mentioned this in our ed puzzles before, if not in this class, other classes for sure. I know that I talk about no margin, no mission. I worked for a long time for a Catholic hospital, so that was one of our mantras in the financial area, which is where I worked, was in finance and reimbursement. So no margin, no mission is about where, in order for, oftentimes we think about nonprofit organizations not making a profit. And nonprofit doesn't mean no profit. Nonprofit means that that profit is turned around back into the mission of the organization in some way. So if the hospital I worked at, Lourdes Hospital in New York, so if I worked at Lourdes Hospital, sadly, we never made money. We were always in the red at the end of the year. But if we did happen to make money, maybe we made $1 million in a year. That $1 million would not be spent on, it wouldn't go back to the shareholders like it would in a major corporation or a publicly held company. That $1 million would, and it wouldn't go into bonuses for the employees or the executives. That $1 million needs to go back into the organization. Capital expenditures like new buildings, new clinics, that kind of stuff. Things like expanding charity care and those types of things. So the organization must realize a profit in order to have funds to accomplish its mission, which comes from chapter 14. Some people chose either A or the D answer, A and C only. And A is the organization can abandon its mission if it has no margin. The organization can never abandon its mission. And a good example, again, is where I worked at Lourdes Hospital. We never made money. There was most hospitals in New York State don't make money. It's just the nature of the reimbursement system there. Most are really just plodding along trying to stay as close to that zero line as they can. Most of the time they're under it. So it's important to realize that even though we didn't make money, we still had to meet our mission. We were a faith-based hospital. We were there to provide charity care to anybody who needed it. We were there to provide certain services to patients within our community. We provided things like mobile mammography, mobile dental clinics, to get to areas where patients couldn't get to us. And even though we didn't have a ton of money, we still did that. So an organization is never going to abandon its mission. Sometimes they may have to decrease the amount of service that they provide in certain areas. Like I do remember there was one time where we had to park the dental van for a while. And then what they actually did was because the dental van would go to schools. But they would have, instead of the whole van going, we had dentists that worked within our organization that were volunteering to go and do services there. They weren't taking the van. That was expensive and a lot of overhead, but it was a motorhome, gigantic motorhome. It wasn't a van, but it was a massive motorhome where they could do treatments in the van, but the dentists were going in and just doing, general oral checks and referring patients to appropriate dental care if they didn't have it otherwise. So you're never going to abandon that mission. It's just that you really need to make a profit to really accomplish the mission overall. Last one, I think. Why is organ transplantation provided to non-Americans a U.S. microallocation decision? So in the textbook, hopefully you saw there's this, and this was talked about earlier in the text in earlier chapters. So microallocation are individuals being provided service, care, whatever. Microallocation is an ethical examination of access to something, or provision of justice is really what it's about. So microallocation is individually based. Macroallocation is population based. So in the U.S., organ transplantation to U.S. citizens is a macroallocation decision. In other words, there are a lot of people waiting on the list that are American citizens that are waiting for organs, and there's a very detailed process as to how one would get those organs through organ procurement organizations. For non-Americans, it would be a microallocation. We don't provide organs to everybody across the world. It would be a microallocation decision. There are some areas where some countries where organ transplantation isn't allowed, where they don't do those types of services. It goes against the culture and perhaps the prevailing religion in that country, those types of things. So there may be some instances when a non-American can come to the U.S. and get an organ transplant, but they are going to be very, very few and far between. And it would be that microallocation decision. Look at this individual, make a decision based on their individual circumstances, as opposed to it's a macro allocation decision for Americans receiving transplants here, because we all fall within that normal organ procurement organization protocol. That doesn't mean that everyone that needs an organ is going to get one, unfortunately, just because there aren't enough. But everyone has a chance to get one in this country. So that's it. This is the beginning of the slides for our for the next section for the lecture. So we'll talk about, in the lecture, we'll talk about consent, death and dying, and physician-assisted suicide and autonomy. So we'll talk about those things there. Like I said, I'll separate that out and make it a separate YouTube video. If you have any questions, let me know. Like I said, I'll get feedback back to you this week with regard to your final project areas. And I think that's it. So look forward to talking to everyone this week in the classroom. Thanks.